Okay, hi grade 8. I'm going to give you a lecture today on the digestive system and the respiratory system. So I'm going to flip between my notes and the board. Just let me grab your textbook real quick here and I'll show you the pages. Okay, digestive system starts on page 127. All right, so we're going to talk about the digestive system, the respiratory system, and the circulatory system today. I'm going to do the digestive and the respiratory system in the same lecture today, and I'll do the circulatory system separately because I'll probably do a hard dissection for you. So page 127. So you should read through these pages, page 127 to 131. There's some good questions on page 131 that you might want to do for review. Respiratory system starts on page 132 and goes to 134. Okay, and then there's some good questions on page 134. All right, so the digestive system functions first and foremost. Digestion is different from excretion as well, right? So the purpose of the digestive system is we obtain energy from food, and our three main nutrients are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. The digestive system breaks these down into small usable parts for uptake by cells, and we're going to talk about that. There's two main types of digestion, mechanical and chemical. All right, so we not only take in energy from food, but we also get rid of it through fecal matter at the end point of the digestive system, which is why I made the point that it's different from the excretory system, because the excretory system takes metabolic waste from our cells and filters it out through our blood, and that ends up in our kidneys, and then we essentially urinate that out. So when we have a bowel movement, that's food from the digestive system that actually never made it into our body to begin with as a nutrient. Okay. So with the digestive system, the top part obviously starts with the mouth, and then you have two tubes actually, right, in your throat. There's the trachea, which is in front of the esophagus, and that's the respiratory system, and then I'll go to the lungs. And then behind that is the esophagus, and this is the esophagus right here. And the esophagus is your food tube, and it goes down, it empties into the stomach. All right, there is a valve here between the esophagus and the stomach. It's kind of like a little drawstring. It's called the cardiac sphincter. So sphincter is a fun little word. So we have these little drawstring circular muscular valves called sphincters throughout our digestive system. Okay, so this is where the first one would be. All right, so the cardiac sphincter will be between the esophagus and the stomach. The stomach itself is where chemical digestion starts. We also have mechanical digestion, so we break our food up from big parts into small parts, but then we also start to chemically alter it here. Okay, so food travels from mouth, stomach, it leaves the stomach. This is the end of the stomach here. There's another sphincter called the pyloric sphincter, P-Y-L-O-R-I-C. Cardiac is C-A-R-D-I-A-C, where the cardiac sphincter is at the top of the stomach. And then food empties into the top of the small intestine. It moves through the small intestine where we break it down and then reabsorb it. And then the waste that isn't used ends up in the large intestine. And then that's what this is right here. So it is around the small intestine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what all these different things do. This green organ here is the pancreas. This is the liver, and this is the gallbladder. So food does not enter the pancreas and the liver. Enzymes and hormones come from the pancreas and the liver to help break down food. Okay, so that's important for us to understand. So food goes from mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then the waste products leave that we don't actually use. So we're going to talk about what all these different things do. Okay, so there's two types of digestion. Mechanical digestion is the physical breakdown of food into small pieces. Mechanical digestion mostly occurs in the mouth, but it also occurs in the stomach. Now, I showed you a dissection yesterday, and you saw the muscular walls of the stomach itself, right? The muscular walls of the stomach help to pulverize food into small parts. So with mechanical digestion, we're not actually turning food into different component parts. We're actually breaking up small pieces of food into big pieces of food into small pieces of food. So if I start to chew an apple at the end of mechanical digestion, I'll just have smaller pieces of apple. All right. If I'm gonna eat a steak, then when I chew my steak will just end up as smaller pieces of steak. I haven't turned it into the component proteins, carbohydrates, and fats yet that the steak's actually made of. That's what chemical digestion does. Okay, so this is chemical digestion. So chemical digestion is the chemical modification of larger particles into smaller particles. All right, so it's the breakdown of complex carbohydrates, fats, and proteins into their basic parts. So I'm actually changing the nutrients that I chew into something different at the end of chemical digestion. So we use enzymes and hormones and other molecules from the liver and the pancreas to do that. All right, so enzymes are primarily responsible for this. Large food particles need to be broken down into their simplest forms in order to be absorbed by the digestive system. Okay, so food's journey, right? So chemical and mechanical digestion begin at the mouth. Teeth start to break down food. Saliva in our mouth moistens to make food easier to chew. There's also enzymes that start to break down sugar in the mouth that comes from your saliva, right? So that's what the next point says. And then the tongue pushes food back to the mouth, and then it enters the esophagus. Okay, so in the esophagus itself, flap of skin called the epiglottis prevents food from entering your windpipe. So it moves over the entrance of it when swallowing. All right, so when we swallow, the epiglottis actually moves over the trachea. Right, so when you choke on your food, sometimes it's because food goes down your trachea, or like when you talk with food in your mouth, or if you're laughing while eating at the same time. Sometimes the food can end up in your respiratory system, and then we choke it up. So food moves through your esophagus through the rest of your digestive system through muscular tractions called peristalsis. All right, so you have smooth muscles that line your digestive tract. So smooth muscles are muscles that we don't have conscious control of. So this does it on its own. So peristalsis kind of moves, it's kind of like a toothpaste tube. All right? So there's muscle contraction behind the food itself, and then so you have a contraction behind the food and then relaxation in front of the food. And then the food moves through the digestive tract through this rhythmic muscle contraction of contraction and relaxation. Food gets pulverized into this circular form called a bolus. So this is a bolus of food. Okay? So peristalsis is how food moves through the digestive tract. And you can see this here. So you have the squeezing of the smooth muscle behind the food and the relaxation in front. And as we squeeze behind, the food gets pushed through. So it's like pushing toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. Okay? From the esophagus, we go through the cardiac sphincter and into the stomach. Okay, so let me move back here. All right, so the stomach itself is very muscular. You can see that there's different lines of muscle contraction. Okay? So its muscles contract and churn and turn the food into a liquid consistency. This liquid is called chyme. So that's something you should know. So the food gets pulverized in your stomach into this kind of like liquid baby pablum. And that's called chyme. Okay? Gastric juice gets released from the walls of the stomach to aid in this process. So the gastric juice itself contains a mucus, and so mucus is, it's like a fatty combination of carbohydrate, okay? And it smothers the food. Hydrochloric acid is actually in your stomach to neutralize toxins, so we make HCl naturally. So your stomach's pH is really, really low. It's like a pH of 2. All right, so that's stomach acid and enzymes to start to break down food. So we do a lot of mechanical digestion in the stomach, but we also start chemical digestion, okay? So the mucus prevents the stomach acid from digesting the stomach itself. So the mucus will line the stomach wall, all right? And that will protect the stomach wall from the hydrochloric acid disintegrating the stomach wall. Okay, so the stomach is lined with these rough outcroppings here. So I showed you this when I dissected the frog yesterday. But all these little striated lines are called rugae. And so it kind of acts like a bit of a jackhammer to pulverize food. So the stomach contracts when food enters it, okay? And then the rugae helps with that breakup of food. Okay, so stomach. Now the small intestine so the small intestine is actually a lot longer than the large intestine, but its diameter is about half the size. So that's why it's called the small intestine. So the small intestine is where the majority of our chemical digestion occurs. Okay, so enzymes from the pancreas break down starch and protein. The liver produces bile, which separates fat into smaller particles. Now that's pretty simplified. The liver and the pancreas do quite a bit more than that. But know that the pancreas is mostly connected to starch or sugar, and the liver itself is mostly connected to fat and protein. But the pancreas and the liver kind of tag team the breakdown of protein, right? So if you know anything about insulin with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, you know that the pancreas produces insulin and controls blood sugar, right? So it makes sense that the pancreas helps with the breakdown of that. In the small intestine, there's these little finger-like projections called villi. And then they have little hair cells on them called microvilli. And what the villi and microvilli do is after we've chemically digested food, the villi and microvilli absorb the food particles and move it into our bloodstream in order to send it to our organs. Okay? So we reabsorb nutrients from the villi and microvilli. And the microvilli greatly increase the surface area for absorption as they project off the villi in themselves. The large intestine, chemical digestion is complete here. It's not as long as the small intestine, but it's much wider. Now this is where we reabsorb water, so we'll dehydrate food waste and we'll create feces here. So, let's say you don't have solid feces and you have watery feces like diarrhea. It means that you probably have an irritation of your intestinal lining and water is not being reabsorbed. So, like a bacterial infection or something like that could cause that. So the purpose is to reabsorb water, and we reabsorb minerals and nutrients from the large intestine. Waste products are converted into feces, and feces gets its brown color from bile from the gallbladder and from broken down hemoglobin in our red blood cells, actually. All right? And then we excrete fecal matter from the, from the end of the digestive tract, the end of the large intestine, which the rectum is where fecal matter is stored, and then it's expelled out the anus. Okay, so here's an actual electron microscope diagram of the villi and microvilli. So these are the villi, and then these little pink projections off the villi or the microvilli, and that's where we reabsorb most of our nutrients. And rather than having a smooth surface, we have this surface with the villi and microvilli to increase the surface area for absorption. So there's more contact of the substrate that we are digesting, so the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. There's more contact points, so we can reabsorb more of it if we have that villi and microvilli. And this is a diagram of what a villi and microvilli looks like. So if we look at our stomach, our intestinal wall, okay, so the intestinal wall, kind of moves like this. So we have these little projections off of that, and then they have little hair cells. So the projections are the villi, and the little hair cells are the microvilli. Okay, and we have millions of them through the intestinal wall. Okay, so just a reminder of this: mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then end of the digestive tract. So you have to know that order, and you have to know what the different things do. You need to know the difference between chemical and mechanical digestion as well. Okay. So mechanical breaks big pieces into small pieces, and chemical digestion actually chemically alters food into different component parts. So if we look at, let's say sugar. So let's say I'm going to eat a bag of Sour Patch Kids today. Hopefully you don't, because that's not healthy, but maybe I'm binging. The Sour Patch Kids are composed of long chains of sugar. So if this is a long chain of sugar, what I'm going to do after chemical digestion is I'm going to break that into single units of sugar. So it's not the same thing after it's been chemically altered. Okay? And then my body can absorb this. So I'm going to break the big chains into smaller chains and alter them into their base foundational units. We'll talk about this more in high school biology, but just so you get an introduction to it now, chemical and physical digestion are not the same thing. We actually alter the chemical structure of food with chemical digestion. Okay? So that is the digestive system. That's everything you need to know for that. Let's talk about the respiratory system. So the respiratory system supplies blood, with oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. Now, the main components are similar. They look kind of similar, right? So mouth, nasal cavity, and it's actually more beneficial to breathe through your nose. You can see that there's a bigger cavity for air. And rather than breathing through your mouth, in your nose, you have cilia, and the cilia filters, right? The cilia filters the air. That's where we get like mucus combining with, different particles in the air to make snot, essentially. Most of in the air, there's all sorts of airborne particulate that you're taking in. So inside your nasal cavity, there's cilia or hair cells that help filter that. And actually, most of the airborne particles you take in are sloughed off skin cells from other people. So you're breathing in skin cells from other people, and then it's being filtered out. Your own skin cells too, but it's being filtered out by your hair cells. And then that's where we, get our snotty mucus and things like that. So if you're gonna pick your nose and then take a little meal from that, you're actually eating other people's skin cells. So that's kind of like cannibalism, right? So don't pick your nose. Anyway, the trachea, right? So you have the mouth, and so you have the oral and nasal cavity, and then you have this tube right here. So this tube right here is your windpipe, and that's the trachea. And it has these rings of cartilage around it, so it's open all the time. So it doesn't squeeze like the esophagus. And it's in front of the esophagus, so the esophagus will be behind it, okay? And then you have the larynx here, or the voice box, and the epiglottis is just above that. So the esophagus is behind the trachea. And then you have two lungs, obviously. The trachea breaks up into two main tubes that enter into the right and left lung. These are called the bronchi, and that's what that says right there. And then the bronchi break up into smaller pieces called bronchioles, and then at the end of each bronchiole are the areas for gas exchange, and those are called alveoli. So think of it as kind of like an upside down tree. So the trunk of the roots would be like the mouth and the nose, which kind of makes sense because you're exchanging nutrients, carbon dioxide and oxygen there. The trunk of the tree is the trachea, so that's your main transport package for nutrients coming from the roots, I guess. The bronchi are the main branches, and then the little branches with leaves on them are the bronchioles, and then the alveoli would be like the leaves or the fruit on trees. So think of your respiratory system as like an upside down tree. Okay? All right, so when we breathe, air is moved in and out of the lungs by a difference in air pressure. So when we inhale, we expand our chest cavity, and that creates low pressure inside our body, and as a result, air moves in to equalize that pressure. When we exhale, the chest cavity decreases, so we decrease the volume of the lungs, and that increases the pressure of the lungs as a result, and that forces air out. So you should kind of understand breathing mechanics. All right, so at the base of your lungs is this muscle called the diaphragm. All right, so have you ever gotten the wind knocked out of you and you can't breathe for a bit? That's because your diaphragm's been hit and it's spasming, so it doesn't have control of your lungs for a little bit. But when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and it moves down, and your rib muscles, your intercostals, the things between your ribs, they move out and up. So the diaphragm moves down and your intercostal muscles move out and up. And that increases the chest cavity. Okay? When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and moves up, and the intercostal muscles move down and in. So you can see that down and inward motion. So you move, so the ribs and the intercostals move out and up, and the diaphragm moves down on inhalation, And then on exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, and then the intercostal muscles move down and in, and we force air out. And so that's how breathing occurs. All right, so with gas exchange, we have two organ systems that work together to do this, right? We have the circulatory system and the respiratory system. So the circulatory system brings carbon dioxide and waste products back to the lungs to get breathed out from the body. And then the body, and the circulatory system also distributes oxygen to break down glucose to your cells, right? So your circulatory system does that, and it transports oxygen and CO2 and other waste products that we would get rid of through breathing between the lungs and the blood. So the respiratory system works in tandem with the circulatory system to ensure this happens. All right, so this is an important slide, gas exchange. So the respiratory system, what it does is it brings air rich with oxygen into the lungs through a series of tubes called bronchi. The bronchi are lined with cartilage, right? So the trachea itself has cartilage rings around it that keeps it open. The bronchi also have the cartilage rings. The bronchi break up into smaller tubes called bronchioles, which branch out from the ends of each bronchi. At the end of the bronchioles are air sacs called alveoli. There's a lot of them. There's about 600 million of them in your whole body. And the alveoli is the main site of gas exchange. Alveoli are made of epithelial skin cells, so skin tissue that is very thin, and the alveoli are lined with capillaries. So this is where the respiratory system and the circulatory system meet, is at the alveoli. So capillaries are really small blood vessels. We're going to talk about that with the circulatory system. The air inside the alveoli is rich with oxygen, and so the oxygen gets transferred from the alveoli as we breathe it in into the capillaries and then into your bloodstream. And the blood in the capillaries is rich with carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide goes from your blood vessels into the alveoli, and then we breathe it out and as it goes through your respiratory system. So oxygen moves into the capillaries by diffusion. Carbon dioxide moves into the alveoli the same way. Right? So they're moving from high to low concentration, and we already know about this, right? So the alveoli have high oxygen concentration, so the oxygen leaves the alveoli into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream has high carbon dioxide concentration, so the carbon dioxide moves into the alveoli from the blood. All right? So when we smoke, or vape, I guess, for that matter, too, because there's still solvents in vaporizers, what happens is either tar or the vape solvents. What happens is they smother the alveoli, and we destroy our alveoli. So by smoking or vaporizing, what we do is we destroy the alveoli. So there's no place for gas exchange in the lungs themselves. So that happens whether you are smoking or vaping. All right, and now the issue with smoking is you get tar, right, from the cigarette because of the impurities in the actual cigarette smoke, right? But with vape juice or vaporizing solvents, it's ethylene glycol. So ethylene glycol is antifreeze. So that's the most common solvent. So that's actually a neurotoxin. That ends up in you end up breathing in through your respiratory system, and the ethylene glycol will dissolve into the alveoli, and essentially you're breathing an antifreeze into your alveoli, and it smothers and destroys the alveoli, right? Plus ethylene glycol is a poison, so vaping is not exactly the healthiest thing on earth. All right, so again, this is your respiratory system. So this is your trachea, right? The two main branches are the bronchi, and they go into the right and left lung. And then you have the branches off the bronchi called the bronchioles, and then at the end of each bronchiole is the alveoli. And then the alveoli here exchange gases with the capillaries. All right. So that is digestion and circulation. That will be our lesson for a few days from now. I'm going to sign off, grade 8s. You guys have a good day. Bye now.